Hello again. I've got something a little bit different for you today. I've got a short story. It's by former poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy. It's called Mrs. Scrooge. So that might give you a hint of the sort of thing we're looking at. It's an interesting tale, and it's obviously a little bit longer than what we've had so far. So get yourself comfy, grab a drink, maybe a little snack, and I'll begin. Scrooge, doornail dead, his widow, Mrs. Scrooge, lived by herself in London town. It was that time of year, the clocks long back, when shops were window-dressed with unsold tinsel, trinkets, toys, trivial pursuits, with sequined dresses and designer suits, with chocolates, glazed fruits and marzipan, with Barbie, Action Man, with bubble bath, and aftershave and shower gel. The words Noel and season's greetings brightly mute in neon lights. The city bells had only just chimed 3, but it was dusk already. It had not been light all day. Miss Scrooge sat googling at her desk. Catchit the cat curled at her feet, snowflakes tumbling to the ground below the window, where a robin perched, pecking at seeds. Most turkeys, bred for their meat, are kept in windowless barns, with some containing over 20,000 birds. Turkeys are removed from their crates and hung from shackles by their legs in moving lines. A small fire crackled in the grate. Their heads are dragged under a water bath, electrically charged, before their necks are cut. Mrs. Scrooge pressed print. She planned to visit Marley's supermarket, biggest bargain birds, at 4. Outside, snowier yet, and cold. Piercing, searching, biting cold. The cold gnawed noses just as dogs gnawed bones. It iced the mobile phones pressed tight to ears. The coldest Christmas Eve in years saw Mrs. Scrooge at Marley's handing out leaflets. The shoppers staggered past, weighed down with bags or pushing trolleys, crammed with breasts, legs, crowns, eggs, sausages, giant stalks of Brussels sprouts, carrots, spuds, bouquets of broccoli, mange tout, courgettes, petit pois, foie gras, with salmon, Stilton, pork pies, mince pies, Christmas pudding, custard, port, gin, sherry, whiskey, fizz and plonk, all done on credit cards. Most shook their head at Mrs. Scrooge, irked by her cry, "Find out how turkeys really die!" or shoved her leaflet in their pockets of their coats, unread, or laughed and called back, "Spoiled sport, ho ho ho!" 3 hours went by like this. The snow began to ease as she walked home. She hated waste, consumerism, Mrs. Scrooge, foraged in the London parks for chestnuts, mushrooms, blackberries, ate leftovers, recycled, mended, passed on, purchased second-hand, turned the heating down and put layers on, walked everywhere, drank tap water, used public libraries, possessed a wind-up radio, switched off lights, lit candles. Darkness is cheap, and Mrs. Scrooge liked it, and would not spend 1 penny on a plastic bag. She passed off licence with 6 for 5, bookshops with 3 for 2, food stores with buy one get one free. Above her, the Christmas lights danced like a river towards a sea of dark. The national power grid moaned, endangered like a whale. The Thames flowed on as Mrs. Scrooge proceeded on her way towards her rooms. Nobody lived in the building now but her, and all the other flats were boarded up. Whatever the developers had offered Mrs. Scrooge to move could never be enough. She liked it where it was, lurking in the corner of a yard, as though the house had run their young, playing hide and seek, and had forgotten the way out. She remembered her first Christmas there with Scrooge, the single stripy sweet he'd given her that year, and every year. But Scrooge was dead, no doubt of that. So why, her key turning the lock, did she see in the knocker Scrooge's face? His face to the life, staring back at her, with living grey-green eyes and opening metal lips. As Mrs. Scrooge looked fixedly at this, it turned into a knocker once again. Up the echoing stairs, to slippers, simple supper, candles, cocoa, cat, went Mrs. Scrooge, not scared, but oddly comforted at glimpsing Scrooge's knockered face. But still, she double-locked the door, put on her dressing gown, and sat down by the fire to sip her soup. The fire was very low indeed, not much on such a bitter night, so soon enough she went to bed. Nightcap, bed socks, Scrooge's old pyjamas, hot water bottle, Cratchit's purr, and then her own soft snore. She dreamed of Scrooge, of Christmas past, of Christmas present, Christmas yet to come. Dreams that seemed to trap her in a snowstorm bowl, newly married, ice skating with Scrooge, two necks in one long, bright red, woolly scarf, or hanging baubles on the tree, or being surprised by mistletoe, his kiss, the taste of him. But then her world was shaken violently, and she was kneeling by a grave, hearing a funeral bell. Midnight rang out from St. Paul's. She gasped awake. The twice-locked door was wide open, and all the room was filled with light, and smelled of tangerines and cinnamon and wine. A cheerful ghost was perched and grinning on her bed, now like a child, now like a wise old man, with silver hair and berried holly for a crown, and yet its shimmering dress was trimmed with flowers. "Good grief!" said Mrs. Scrooge. "Who the hell are you?" The ghost squealed with delight and clapped its hands. A hard thing for a ghost to do, thought Mrs. Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," it trilled. "Now rise and walk with me." It took her by the hand, then flew through her open bedroom window. They stood at once upon an old country road, with fields on either side. The city had entirely gone, the darkness too. It was a sparkling winter's day, all blinged with frost. "I know this place," cried Mrs. Scrooge. "I grew up here. We're near the village of Heathrow. My family kept an orchard close here." They walked along the road, Mrs. Scrooge recalling every gate and post and tree. "That way's Harmondsworth," she told the ghost excitedly. "Famous for Richard Cox, you know, who cultivated Cox's orange pippin." The merry ghost conjured an apple from the air. She crunched delightedly. "That way's Longford village. That way's the farm at Perry Oaks. And that way's Simpson's Green." They'd reached the village now. A green, a row of houses and an inn. 2 fields away, a farm. Beyond that farm, another farm. The landscape glittering as if it were in love with light. A laughing local bunch of lads ran by. Mrs. Scrooge went red. "I snogged that tall one once," she said. "They're shadows," said the ghost. "They have no consciousness of us." High in the sky there came an aeroplane, rare enough to make the boys stand pointing at the endless, generous air, and yell out, "Merry Christmas!" to the plane. "This is the past. It cannot come again," went on the ghost. "It is the gift your soul gives to your heart." Mrs. Scrooge stopped in the road and turned. "Why show me this?" she asked. "Because," the ghost replied, "Scrooge sends a message from the grave. Keep going. You shall overcome." "No runway 3!" cried Mrs. Scrooge, the breath her words made like a ghost itself, swooning, vanishing. But when she looked, the face of Christmas past bent down, just like a lover stoops to steal a kiss. And then her lips were soft, then salty, tasting tears, her own, and then she woke, at home, and old, and all alone. Not quite alone. For Catchett dozed and snuggled at her feet, visions of Robin Redbreast in his head. London's moon, the moon of Shakespeare, Dickens, Oscar, Virginia Woolf, shone down on silent theatres, banks, hotels, on palaces and doss houses and parks, on Mrs. Scrooge, who lay wide-eyed and fretful in the dark. She heard a scrabbling noise inside the chimney breast, and sat bolt upright in bed. "Who's there?" she said. Then, with a thump, a flash, a figure in a crimson Santa suit glowed in the grate, as if the fire had taken human shape and combed itself a beard from its smoke. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," boomed the ghost. "Now rise and come with me." Before she knew it, Mrs. Scrooge sat in a sleigh, being pulled by reindeer through the starry sky. Tying a ribbon around the earth, the ghost of Christmas present talking as they flew, naming the oceans, forests, mountain ranges far below, until the Arctic Circle rose beneath them like a moon. They landed, skidding on the ice, in a percussion of sharp hooves and jingle bells. Tears, like opals, fell then froze on Mrs. Scrooge's cheeks as she looked. She stood upon a continent of ice, which sparkled between sea and sky, endless and dazzling, as though the world kept all its treasure there, a scale which balanced poetry and prayer. But then she heard a cracking, rumbling groan, and saw huge icebergs carving from the floe into the sea. Then, further out, a polar bear floating, stranded, on a raft of ice. "The polar ice cap melting," said the ghost. "Can mankind save it?" "Yes, we can," cried Scrooge. "We must." "I bring encouragement from Scrooge's dust," replied the ghost. "Never give up. Don't think one ordinary human life can make no difference, for it can." The reindeer steamed and snorted in the snow. Mrs. Scrooge stretched out her hand to one, stroking the warm, rough texture of its hide, which seemed to alter, soften, into Catchett's fur. The North Pole vanished like a snuffed-out flame. She woke again. "Old fool," she said to herself. "These are just dreams." She pulled her blankets up beneath her chin and lay there, worrying about large things and small. The wall flickered with strange shadows, shifting shapes, a turkey and then a bear, and then a hooded form, which pointed at her silently until it swelled and stood and spoke. "I am the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Rise now and follow me." It took her in its arms like a bride, and flew through a winter wood towards a clearing, and an open grave, around which mourners stood, then put her down. "My family," said Mrs. Scrooge. "There's Bob, and that's his lovely wife. There are my grandchildren, Peter, Martha, Tiny Tim, look. They're my dearest friends, the Fezziwigs. They're girls. Why are we here? Who died?" The spirit pointed downward to the grave. Mrs. Scrooge crept near and peeped into a wormy, loamy hole. She saw a cardboard coffin, crayoned brightly with a name, cartooned with flowers, faces, animals, covered with poems, kisses, hearts. She turned. At once she stood beside the ghost, inside a huge and crowded room, her family and friends piling in. In came a fiddler with a music book, who started up a jig. Mrs. Scrooge, who loved a whirl, restrained herself from dancing with the ghost. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile, bearing a tray of homemade warm mince pies, saying, "She would have wanted it this way." In came the Fezziwig's girls with babies chuckling in their arms. In came tall nephews arm in arm with little aunts. In came old comrades, with whom she'd marched in protest against every kind of harm. In they all came, aglow with life and possibility. Old and young, away they went, 20 couples all at once. Gay and straight, down the middle, up and round again, the beaming fiddler trying to saw his instrument in half. There was never such a wake. More dancing, then more music. Someone sang, shed several tears. Then mince pies, cake, mulled wine, cold beer, more wine, more beer. Then Mrs. Scrooge heard a cheer, and there was Tiny Tim, up on a chair. There was a hush. "A toast," cried Tiny Tim, "to my grandmother, the best woman who ever was. She taught us all to value everything, to give ourselves, to live as each day was Christmas Day." Another cheer, and Mrs. Scrooge's name rang out from everybody's lips. She seemed to float above them, all the bright familiar faces looking up, raised glasses in the air. She heard Bob say, "She really had a wonderful life." The ghost of Christmas yet to come pulled back its hood. She looked into its smiling, loving, grey-green eyes and understood. Advertisement. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell. Bell, ding, dong, hammer, clash, clang. It was St. Paul's again, gargling in its morning bell, the room her own, and dribbling Catchit, staring down at her from her chest. Quickly Mrs. Scrooge showered and dressed. She flung open the window and leaned out. A clear, bright, jovial, cold and glorious day. The doorbell rang. Down she hurried, opened wide the door, and in they poured, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Bob, Bob's wife, the children, the grandchildren, the Fezziwigs, their girls, babies, partners, all shouting, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" What news they had! The credit crunch had forced the property developers to sell the empty flats below to the Fezziwigs girls. So come the new year, all 3 were moving in. Hurrah! Hurrah! What did Mrs. Scrooge think of that? And would she babysit? Bob came grinning from the kitchen with a tray of glasses of Buck's Fizz. Mrs. Fezziwig and Mrs. Scrooge cuddled and wept with joy. And that delightful boy, Tiny Tim, called out, "Here you are, Grandma, the sweet that Grandad gave you every Christmas that he lived." "A humbug!" exclaimed Mrs. Scrooge. "God bless us, everyone!" cried Tiny Tim. I think that's quite a beautiful version of A Christmas Carol. And I'd expect nothing less from Carol and Duffy. I hope you've enjoyed that. I thought that was beautiful. I'll see you tomorrow.